Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. This is our fourth part of the webinar. Just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen and introduce Gary. Hi, Gary. He's the CEO and founder of SquadLocker. And Mark is calling from California today. And he is VP of Strategy for Augusta Brands, one of our very important partners. So can you see my slides, Mark and Gary? Can you see the picture?
I do not see slides, but I hear you clearly, and I see Mark's beautiful smile.
You see his smile.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Yes. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Let me go back to go to webinar. It's asking me to share, and I'm saying show my screen. Show my screen. Please show my screen. It's not showing my screen.
It's interesting. Is there two? Show my screen and please show my screen?
Yes. I'm begging, please show my screen.
Well, it worked because the please worked. We can see
it please work to go to webinar. Isn't that wonderful? This is so terrific. So thank you, Gary and Mark, for joining us today. The topic that we wanted to talk about in part 3 was a little bit more about technology. And Mark, you're involved in a number of different organizations in your role at Augusta. And you had sent me some really interesting information that we wanted to be able to share with our audience today. But first of all, we want to remind everybody on the call, we are recording this webinar. You will get the slides with the information. I've included links and a lot of data here. Please ask questions in the GoToWebinar panel. There's a question box there, and I will be monitoring all the questions and then asking Gary and Mark at the end. We're continuing this series on the return to play theme. This is number 3 of our series. We've been doing them monthly. And just as a reminder, we're not providing legal and/or medical advice, even though we like to play lawyers and doctors on TV, but we're not doing anything as it relates to anything having to do with the pandemic. So again, return to play, innovation and technology. Mark Botterill, VP of Strategy at Augusta Sportswear, and Gary Goldberg, co-founder and CEO of SquadLocker. So one of the things we talked about, Mark, earlier is that there's a new normal now. So did you want to kind of address it before I moved into the data points?
Oh boy, a new normal. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's oxymoronic, but yeah, I mean, for sure, there's been a ton of, the constant theme is there's a lot of pent-up demand for children to participate in youth sports, right? So that's a given. And I think for the most part, there's a lot of ambition in getting children back onto the fields for the health and welfare of all, right? And a couple of interesting data points that I think you're going to point to here later is very, very interesting program called Kids First Campaign, which I think we're going to share later.
I think I can move it. Yep, there it is. We want to talk about that now. I put this data up there.
Sure. So I think, again, I think the nature of the attendees have been primarily SquadLocker customers who are running programs. So this Kids First campaign is an excellent, I think, summary of the reality of training and the effects of COVID. So you can see those numbers. I don't have to go through them, but if you want to follow something, I'd follow Kids First campaign. I think that's gathering a lot of momentum in the circles that I sort of enter into a little bit. And then there is a program that the University of Wisconsin has been working on, Dr. Brian Watson, on the negative effects of the shutdown on youth sports.
Right.
I think you're looking at the morning consult there, and so again, you can get that from the Kids First campaign. It's actually, that white paper is actually added to that document. But those are the two that I've seen that have gathered the most momentum in the last month, last 30 days. It's topical, it's on point, it's taking real-time data, and so.
Mark, any sense of some of the negatives on not participating, just off the top of your head? I can imagine the the negative effects as it goes to emotional wellness, physical wellness, connectivity, social connections to peers, and free time for play and all that stuff. Is it as simple as that, or is it more severe, like increase in obesity, increase in kids not getting medical attention because they're not actually testing their bodies? What have you read? What are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're 100% accurate. I mean, there are obvious data points around around the mental well-being of children. Terrible suicide, attempts, and unfortunately, there have been some child suicides, obviously, that have stemmed from this in terms of isolation feelings and all kinds of things, right? So, okay, so those are the heavy issues. I mean, and they're there, and they're pointed into into that report. I think what's interesting to me is the long-term effect or medium-term effect on the sports business, and that you're looking at statistics somewhere around 23% of children who have now lost interest in participating in sports. So they found something else, right? In some cases, it's esports, and some cases it's other electronic devices that they're just lack of interest. And then you've got this continuing problem behind transportation, and that parents who now are in second jobs or third jobs are saying, look, I cannot get my children to facilities, so you better plan on us not participating right now while we can't transport our kids. And that's raised a whole other series of issues behind, can sports go back to the city? There's this sort of attitudinal process that the governments and municipalities will give you tax breaks if you build something an hour and a half out of the city. There are lots of facilities that you probably know too that are built way outside of the demographics that they're serving because of cheap land and incentives to build there. But it's actually not really helping. It fits a need, in some areas for sure, where you can play multiple events and tournaments. But again, you're piping into the people at most risk are the parents that aren't the most invested. Right.
Mark, when you were a kid and you grew up somewhere where they taught you how to speak with a funny tongue,
yeah,
because you don't sound like the other people that I know. But anyway, my parents never drove me anywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know what transpired between this infrastructure build around places, but if I couldn't get there on my bike, well, tough noogies, I wasn't going. So, this idea around transportation being some sort of an excuse, I don't know what happened with the way parents and kids behave with each other and get to their places. I mean, I do know raising my 3 kids, it was super organized and super structured, and we drove them to all that stuff. And it's just, I would love to see maybe if anything could happen here, would be a less reliance post-COVID on cars and planes and trains and a more hyper-localization, a return to hyper-localization.
You raise a great point. I mean, there's been a systemic switch in the way that parents have sort of monitored their children, because we don't necessarily live in a safe society today, unfortunately. And so I took the train, right, to any game that I went to. My parents rarely ever went to any game. And we've gone through a generational switch, and I played every night, right? I mean, it wasn't a lack of opportunity for my parents to get to the game. It just wasn't something they did. And we've gone through this shift over the last 2 generations in which parents have myopically been involved in their kids' game. But there are some points that folks want to look to. If you look at the over and under initiative ran by Kyle Martino and some of his friends, where they're basically, and I think SquadLocker is involved in some of those things like Peace Court, etc. But if you look at what those guys are doing, and they're trying to take facilities inside cities that are either blacktop, tarmac in England, obviously, but blacktop, and trying to make those a multi-sport facility. And so that initiative around the country is popping up. You look at Soccer in the Streets, who are building facilities right next to transportation hubs like the MARTA train station in Atlanta, where kids can get a free ticket to transport themselves on Atlanta stations, and then get to train stations and simply jump off the train and get into some facilities, sport facilities to play. So I think there's been some engineering behind, trying to address facilities right in the cities. But it's an attitudinal governmental change that the Play Coalition is addressing at the moment to try and get facilities. There certainly aren't going to be some lush 11-on-11 soccer facility or a brand new diamond, but they're going to be play spaces that can be retrofitted to create a different playing environment to get children into sports that don't have the barrier of transportation. But it's a real thing. I mean, it's happening.
Cool. Wow. Got it. I love the transformation. I'm just looking at the Soccer in the Streets website. It looks tremendous, and the over and the under initiative. It's just this is the transformation where we've tried to take things and make them facility driven or infrastructure driven, and then this is the market kind of snapping back and saying, hey, that's great, but that's not accessible for large portions of the population. So how do we transform what's available for them in order to get them back involved? Them being the young kids who don't have access to the mega facilities or the car rides everywhere and stuff like that. So it's great to see that there are things out there. Thanks for sharing that with us, Mark.
And I think, you've been involved in some of those things. Your heart and soul is into this as well, right? Whether it's reclaiming basketball courts that you're involved in now. And I think, leaders, captains of industry like yourself, I think need to get behind the less invested parent. I mean, that's probably a pretty poor title, but the less invested parent has got to find solutions that are close to home in manufacturing, right? When we talk about near sourcing as a solution. And so near sourcing facilities for children who are at the most risk of being lost to sports is a critical function. So if you're running a youth soccer program or a lacrosse program, I think today you've got to have a strategy. If you look at take a look at NHL, right? For example, I think it's a great example. People that can't afford ice time, so they build a stick and puck program that will be on school gymnasium floors and in school backyards to build an NHL-like program that addresses the aura of playing hockey, but they're going to have to switch to a street ball program, right, to be able to address the ability to get there. And so if you're running a youth sports program today, I think you've got to have a strategy that says, well, how do I bring the sport to the demographic, knowing that maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 4 are just not going to be able to be transported to a training center that people just can't get to.
Mark, to that point, can you share with the audience a little bit about what's going on with PAL and how PAL is trying to connect the kids who may not have access to, programs and infrastructure? I just think there's a really interesting dynamic there around the resource of the Police Athletic League and, the communities currently in the backdrop of what's going on, across the country. I just love to know how they're positively impacting.
I think that, obviously the police force today is a delicate issue socially at the moment. And, and I feel for them right now in every way, shape or form. As to, when you start peeling back what the police do, right, on an everyday basis, they are critically involved in youth sports development. And I think you're mentioning the National Police Athletic Leagues that are around the country, almost now 400 of them, which primarily fully fund the kids to participate. And most of these guys, whether in Broward County, Detroit, New York, run some phenomenal programs that are beyond just the sport. So I think what they've done is exactly what we've just talked about, is that they've tried to figure out how to build and create environments to play within the city. Right? So they've been able to successfully do that. But they've also provided a great connectivity to schools. And the mission behind the PAL is a unique one, but they've connected to the schools. They've used blacktops in schools, and they provided a tremendous amount of diversity in sport. Right, and they run some non-traditional sports that people are not that interested in. They're very strong in boxing, for example. But they've diversified their sport menu. They've utilized Central City facilities. They've morphed their playing environment. And they've made it cost effective.
That's great. All right, let's go back to Gene because we've completely derailed the conversation and probably heard.
Yeah, well, it's a better conversation, I'm sure. We wanted to talk a little bit of, Mark, this is one of the charts that you sent me from the organization that you were mentioning from the data, and this information will be available to our audience today. So you were asking a little bit about what's happening, the risks associated with the rewards of participation versus non-participation. So this was an interesting part of data where many parents feel that should they agree that the benefits outweigh the risks of something like that. And there's a pretty large percentage of total strongly disagree and somewhat disagree. And yet there is where, depending upon the age, it looks like parents of children ages 6 to 12 somewhat agree, and 13 to 18. It's maybe smaller children, and it gets back to that data point that you had from San Diego County, talking about on the kids first in terms of the data that they were having relative to testing for COVID. So when you look at this, what do you see, Mark?
Well, I think in combination, and I'd be interested in what Gary's thoughts are as a parent,
Okay.
but also as a captain of industry. But I would put this
Captain of
as
industry. I
captain
love
of
it when
industry.
you call me that.
I know.
New title.
I'd
Captain.
rather think of it as captain of a small boat, but industry's okay too.
No, captain of industry. I mean, captain, my captain. So I think in combination, to the listeners, obviously, I think if you tune in to morningconsult.com, I think they probably have some of the best data that's real time. I would put what's on screen in context of a couple of things that are of interest. 1 in 4 sports now are mandating that you play with a mask, right? Which is super interesting. But probably the biggest factor combined with this is in April, Morning Consult asked youth sports organizers, how likely are you to withstand this? And 49%, I think was the number, said that they were going to fail in the next 3 months. That number is now 29%, right? So, okay, so 20-point difference is significant, I think, in terms of people's outlook as to whether they can survive. And I think a lot of that's come from an innovation perspective, much like SquadLocker's innovated this industry through finding ways and listening to their customers and understanding what their customers' needs are, and then architecting programs like MVP and Ship to Home. I think many of Gary's clients and your clients, Gene, have morphed their business significantly, and I think you're seeing that play out in some of these numbers that you see in front of you, that confidence is starting to build back. So, if you look at the national, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the, sugar plums. I don't think I put that data in there. Yeah. So sugar plums.
Sugar plums.
So I guess what you had another bit of data where you were talking about the benefits outweighing the risks and that sort of thing. But there was a lot of information in that particular, that organization. I'm trying to find, not Kids First. I guess I didn't save it, so my bad on this. So I'll change the slides before I send it out to our audience. But this is in terms of the pandemic dragging on. It's been 6 months plus now, and kids are not playing, or the parents are afraid to have the kids, or if they are playing, there's a lot of masks that are involved right now. So if you talk about participation and you talk about this particular information regarding the analysis of what percentage are actually positive. And if you look at the training sessions here, that was something that was interesting. It was in one of these, in the Kids First data, but then in the other data point too, that people are feeling safe, but they're also feeling like they're a little bit in a bubble right now. And it's such a difficult situation. And I hear from a lot of parents myself about people don't know what the right thing is to do. And how are we going to look back on this? What do you think the issue is going to be? Gary?
Yeah, well, I think my sense of it as a parent of 3 kids who are all now in college and successfully deployed into their individual cities where they're living. But I'm on the board of a school, a K through 12 school. And I'm fortunate enough that both of my parents are still alive. And so when I look at this current situation, it would be really helpful if we could start to compartmentalize who truly is at risk. That's really hard to do emotionally. But from a practical standpoint, if you ask 100 kids, hey, do you feel safe to play sports? I would bet that a significantly higher number of them would be enthusiastic to do it and feel confident to do it. The problem isn't about the child getting infected, quite honestly, from what I've read. It's an incredibly low negative effect for someone less than 25 years old to get this terrible illness. The risk becomes when that child goes back home and may live with his or her grandparents, or lives with a parent that has a pre-existing condition that would put them in a higher likelihood to suffer terribly or something even worse. And so the interesting thing about that survey, if I'm going to reinterpret the survey and ask it again in a better way, is it that you don't want your child to play because you're worried about your child getting infected? Or is it you're worried about how that child comes back into your home and hurts Nana, hurts grandpa, hurts dad, hurts mom? That 30% there, I think those are the people like, we don't know what happens if my child becomes a vector of distributing that disease within my immediate family. So if you ask that question again, how do I look back on this? I think, unfortunately, children's freedom is the greatest sacrifice to protect the elderly at this point, because they're little microvectors, right? And so it's not that they shouldn't be playing. And quite frankly, if they get sick, you know, we don't know what the long-term effect is of this disease on kids who've gotten it or people who've gotten that. It's still yet to be determined. Hopefully we won't see something 10 years from now that someone had the disease and they've got permanent damage around some part of their body functioning a certain way. But really what this is control the kids so they don't spread it to the people that could get sick. It's kind of a funny balance, because wouldn't it be better if the people that could potentially get sick just self-isolated and the rest of the people went about their way? Unfortunately, that's maybe not that easy to facilitate, because there's obviously a relationship between the kid and the parent. I really believe that this survey says the parents and the adults are worried about what can happen to them, or the ones that they love who are potentially could be really harmed by the disease. The kids are caught in the crossfire.
That's a very good point, Gary. Mark, what are you seeing, or what do you see when you look at this data, or what do you think when we're looking back at this 6 months from now? Let's look back on where we are today. What do you think we're going to see?
I'd love our listeners, if anybody wants to throw a chat in the chat box. Am I crazy by what I just said? Type Gary's crazy if you think Gary's crazy, or tell me I'm not, but that's the way I'm seeing it.
I would just add one interesting point, I think, to underscore what Gary said for sure, right? Is that if you look at a dramatic drop in basketball in church leagues, it's significant, right? They are probably the hardest hit at the moment, or hardest affected programs in terms of the participation rates that I've seen. And so the rationale is that, okay, we don't mind the kids participating, but what do they leave when the elderly come back to the church facilities after they've been in it? And I know that's a super granular piece, but I've literally heard that multiple times with church associations, that they're not going to be letting their gymnasiums and facilities be used for sports. And they are the hardest hit participation numbers at the moment.
So does that support my hypothesis, Mark?
It does. Yeah. I think that's a genuine concern. That not that the children would transmit, because you look at the National Federation of High Schools numbers today, 7,000 games have gone on in the National Federation of High School Football, the most at-risk sport, right, for non-social distancing, and they've only canceled 1.3% of the games. There has been no evidence of any transmission from team A to team B, and so you're not seeing that, right? I mean, you're not seeing that transmission. But I think that to support your thought, is the genuine concern, if you look at it, that the guys who have been hit the hardest have been churches, so church leagues and church organizations. Their participation numbers are really, really low compared to others. And the primary responses were not letting those facilities be used in the same day that children would participate in sports, and then elderly folks like myself would go into the facility. And that's literally the number one reason why those facilities aren't available.
You know what else is interesting, Mark and Gene, that I'll share with you? I started a podcast that we're going to release soon called On the Whistle, where we interview mentors, leaders, and coaches about their approach and impact on young people playing sports, and how they take that very complex transition between youth and adulthood and making that path as straight line as possible. I've talked to the coaches. I'm talking to the leaders of these programs. I've talked to an NCAA hockey coach. I talked to a Division I football coach. They're suffering. And they're suffering because their purpose in life is to help kids become better athletes and better people. And all of a sudden, overnight, they lost connectivity and connection from their entire customer base, their entire work product. And so this isn't just a kid and parent thing. This is the staff, the coaches, the mentors. They're having a long-term negative consequence of their own isolation, because they get so much joy around being around these kids and young people and helping them through this process. So it's multidimensional. There's all sorts of this negative concuss that that has spread across the industry. I just think we have to be careful not to just think about it as parents and kids too. I mean, it's the people that actually put the programs on that are really being impacted as well.
Yeah, I remember, Mark, you said in our first one of this series back in July that there was a risk. There was the April survey data that said 46% of those youth sports organizations felt like they were at risk, and now it's dropped 17 points to 29%. What do you think? Why do you think that we've had that big of an improvement? I mean, that represents like a 38% improvement in youth sports organizations because they're coming back to play, or what do you think's happening? I mean, it's still not good, 29% that may permanently close, the ones that we need the most probably. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think initially, there were the sky was falling for sure, right? So you got that reaction from folks, sort of a bit of a doomsday atmosphere around the business. But I think again, I go to conserving my purpose to congratulate Gary and the good folks at SquadLocker. If you look at SquadLocker's role in the industry today, which is a very traditional business and generally very difficult to penetrate the marketplace because it's such a mature business, is that it's done with innovation and creativity, but it's also done with listening to what parents, or in your case, your customers wanted. I want it shipped to home. I want it in 3 days. I want it personalized and customized. I want it packaged with expertise and care. And I want it to be a Christmas box that's delivered to my doorstep and have that great experience. Okay, so that innovation hadn't taken place in a long time. And when it did, SquadLocker grabbed a significant market share. So as it relates to anything in business, like youth sports today, you've seen people go to monthly subscriptions instead of fall and spring seasons. So now it's open 12 months of the year. Parents don't have to stop and start and start and stop, but they can pay a monthly subscription to the organization. I see that a lot, and it's an innovation that makes a lot of sense for parents. But they also get a value package, so they can, if it rains and there's no practice, they can go virtually because they build a virtual package of training. So multi-part, multi-use for that innovation. We've seen people, get away from structured training and get into skill acquisition. So we follow USTA tennis, which I think is, if you watch and you're interested in an organization that's innovated tremendously, USTA is probably the most innovative group in terms of their grassroots participation. They've structured a program that's got nothing to do with competitive nature. It's got everything to do with skill acquisition, in the theory that if children have joy in playing, much like a private piano lesson, they'll stay and stay with the program far greater because they will feel confident at their skill sets. And so their entire program has been innovatively grown on skill acquisition and not competition. They've also provided ship-to-home programs that have tennis rackets that are signed by Serena Williams with a story about dreaming to play, to be a great player of tennis. And they've shipped products to home to inspire people. They've also done programs that have given grants to schools for schools to drive participants to their training centers. And so when you see that type of innovation, whether it's SquadLocker in the industry or USTA, you can see the reasons why people are coming back and they're more confident. They've had time to think about their business. They're not, the kingdom of the blind ruled by a one-eyed king type atmosphere. They're now have a chance to sort of say, well, we should do this instead of this, right? We should play 3-on-3 instead of 9-on-9 on blacktops and bring the sport to the local community. So innovation has created, I think, that change in numbers, and I think their clients have responded favorably to it. And there's a little bit more ray of hope than there was before.
Well, that's Gary, did you have something that you wanted to say?
I just saw that, just to support that, I just saw Sports Engine and Max One just announced a partnership where they're providing online training for free to all the Sports Engine accounts and customers from Max One, which is an online training platform that allows coaches to connect and provide training curriculum for athletes to do on their own, and they can track progress of how those athletes are doing stuff. So clearly the technology is filling a piece here and keeping things connected when it's not so easy to do in person as well.
Well, that's great. Well, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Mark or Gary, please pop them into the question part of the control panel that you have with GoToWebinar. I haven't seen any chats or any questions yet. Thank you very much, Gary and Mark, for today's discussion. Part 4 will be held on October 28th. Our guest speaker will be Tracy Fairchild. She currently manages the Rocky Hill Day School Health and Welfare Program, as well as being the field hockey coach. So she's going to be a wonderful speaker for us to talk about the impact, the anxiety, everything that's happening with both the school athletes and their parents, and talking about how she's been able to help them as we try to move forward into some degree of normalcy and with this pandemic. So again, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mark. And everybody, you'll be getting a copy of the slides as well as the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. See you, Mark.
Jack, thanks. It's been my honor to spend some time with you, Gary, and your friends. So thanks very much. Take care, everybody.
Looking forward to
Bye-bye.
seeing you next.
Bye.